The rain against the 32nd floor window of Aerologic's Dynamics sounded like Whisper's urgent, persistent warning of something Eleanor Hayes couldn't quite name yet. She stood with her back to the conference room, watching Seattle's skyline blur through the glass, while behind her 2 women prepared to dismantle 17 years of her life with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed execution. "Eleanor, thank you for coming in." Marcia Klein's voice carried that particular brand of corporate sympathy, manufactured, measured, and utterly devoid of actual feeling. "I'm afraid we've reached a difficult point in the company's restructuring." Eleanor didn't turn around immediately. She let the word hang in the air, tasting its implications. Restructuring. The euphemism of choice for companies that had lost their way and decided to blame their people instead of their leadership. She'd heard it whispered in hallways for weeks, now seen it in the way conversations stopped. When she entered a room, felt it in the sudden distance, between herself and colleagues who'd once sought her counsel. When she finally turned, her expression was perfectly composed. 17 years at Aerologics had taught her the value of emotional discipline, especially when facing corporate predators who fed on vulnerability. "I see," she said, settling into the chair across from Marcia and Olivia from HR. The manila envelope between them might as well have been a death certificate. Marcia leaned forward with practiced concern. "Your contributions to this company have been substantial. The navigation protocols you developed, the AI frameworks, they've been instrumental in our growth. But Aerologics is evolving. We're moving toward a younger, more agile innovation model." "More agile," Eleanor repeated softly. "I assume that's code for less expensive." A flicker of discomfort crossed Olivia's face, but Marcia's expression remained unchanged. "The decision wasn't made lightly. The board feels that fresh perspectives are essential for our next phase of development." Eleanor almost smiled. Fresh perspectives, as if innovation had an expiration date, as if the algorithms that had revolutionized autonomous flight navigation somehow became obsolete when their creator turned 52. "Of course," she said, "and I assume my team will be restructured as well." "Your team is talented," Marcia said carefully. "We're confident they'll adapt to new leadership structures." New leadership. Eleanor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She thought of Miguel, her lead systems architect, who'd started as a junior developer and grown into one of the most brilliant minds in aerospace AI. Of Sarah, whose doctoral thesis on predictive flight modeling had caught Eleanor's attention 5 years ago. Of the entire team that had worked 18-hour days to perfect Pathos, the predictive autonomous threat handling and optimization system that had single-handedly secured Aerologics' billion-dollar contract with Polaris Aviation. "The package includes 18 months of severance," Olivia interjected, sliding the envelope across the table. "Full health benefits continuation, and we're prepared to provide exceptional references." Eleanor opened the envelope and scanned the documents with the same methodical precision she brought to debugging code. 18 months. Generous by industry standards, but it wasn't about the money. It was about the message. "You're valuable enough to pay handsomely to disappear. I'll need your badge laptop and all access credentials by Friday," Olivia continued. "It will handle the transition of your projects to the new team structure." "And my patents?" Eleanor asked quietly. Marcia's pause was barely perceptible. "Any intellectual property developed during your employment naturally remains with Aerologics. That's standard across the industry." Standard, another word that had lost all meaning in the corporate lexicon. Eleanor nodded slowly, her mind already working through the implications, the loopholes, the careful distinctions between what was standard and what was legal. "I understand," she said, standing and gathering the papers. "I assume the team will be notified." "This afternoon," Marcia confirmed. "We want to ensure a smooth transition." Eleanor paused at the door. "And the Pathos Enhancement Project, the one I've been developing?" "We're confident the team can continue that work," Marcia said. "Innovation is a collaborative process." "Of course." Eleanor's smile was paper-thin. "Collaborative." She walked back to her office through corridors that suddenly felt like a museum of her own obsolescence. The awards on the walls, Technical Innovation of the Year Distinguished Service, to Aerospace Engineering Pioneer in Autonomous Navigation, seemed to mock her now. 17 years of 60-hour weeks of solving problems no one else could solve, of building systems that kept aircraft safe in storms that would have been deadly just a decade ago. Her office felt smaller than it had that morning. The photographs on her desk, her team at the FAA Innovation Expo, the celebration dinner after the Polaris contract, signing the candid shot of her and David at her PhD graduation 23 years ago, belonged to a different person now. Someone who'd believed that excellence was protection, that innovation earned respect, that loyalty was mutual. She sat down at her computer and began typing her resignation letter, though she knew it was a formality. In the corporate world, being asked to leave was different from choosing to leave, and everyone knew it. But she would control the narrative as much as possible. As she wrote, her phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. "Emergency team meeting, called for 3 p.m. What's going on?" She stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "I'll explain everything tonight. Dinner at Romano's 7 p.m., my treat." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of mechanical tasks. She backed up her personal files, cleaned out her desk drawers, and prepared transition documents with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made her legendary in the industry. But her mind was elsewhere, processing the morning's revelation through the lens of everything she knew about corporate law, intellectual property, and the darker arts of business warfare. By 6 o'clock, Aerologix's headquarters had emptied, except for the security guards and the cleaning crew. Eleanor remained at her desk, ostensibly finishing her transition documents, but actually conducting a very different kind of work. She pulled up the internal project management system and began tracing the digital paper trail of Pathos development. What she found was both infuriating and illuminating. The original Pathos system, the one that had secured the Polaris contract, was indeed developed on company time with company resources. But for the past 6 months, she'd been working on Pathos 2.0, a revolutionary enhancement that improved response times by 38% and introduced predictive threat modeling that bordered on prescient. The development logs showed clearly that this work had been done outside normal business hours, using her personal development environment with computational resources she'd paid for herself. More interesting was what she didn't find: no patent applications, no intellectual property filings, no documentation of ownership claims. Aerologix had been so focused on the immediate profits from Pathos 1, I0, that they'd apparently overlooked the next-generation system brewing in Eleanor's home office. She pulled up the corporate email system and began searching for any mention of post-Hayes or succession planning. What she found made her stomach clench with a mixture of rage and vindication. A thread from 3 weeks ago between Marcia Victor Baines, the CTO, and James Morrison, the CEO. laid out their strategy in stark terms. Phase out Hayes while retaining her systems, consolidate IP under corporate ownership, hire 2 to 3 junior developers at combined salary less than her current package. Another email, this one from Victor to the board, was even more damning. Hayes has become a single point of failure. Her systems are too dependent on her knowledge. We need to democratize the technology before she becomes a liability. Eleanor screenshot everything, saved it to an encrypted drive, and then deleted her browsing history. She was learning to think like her opponents, strategically, ruthlessly, with no room for sentiment. At Romano's that evening, her team gathered around a corner table with the confused energy of people who knew something was wrong but couldn't quite identify the threat. Miguel arrived first, followed by Sarah, then David Chen, Lisa Martinez, and finally Alex Petrov, the 5 people who'd helped her build something extraordinary. "They're letting me go," Eleanor said without preamble once everyone had ordered. "Effective Friday." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's face went pale. Miguel's hands clenched into fists. David stared at his untouched wine glass as if it contained answers. "That's insane," Lisa finally said. "You are the navigation department. Your patents are worth more than half the company's valuation." "My patents," Eleanor said carefully, "are apparently now their patents." "Like hell they are," Miguel snapped. "You developed half that code in your spare time. I've seen the timestamps." Eleanor looked around the table at these brilliant minds she'd nurtured, guided, and protected. They were more than colleagues, they were her legacy, her proof that technical excellence could be passed down, multiplied, made to flourish. And now they were about to be fed to the corporate machine that had just devoured her. "What are you going to do?" Alex asked quietly. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, swirling her wine and thinking. "I'm going to show them the difference between owning code and understanding it." The next morning, Eleanor woke at 5 a.m. and walked to her home office, a converted bedroom filled with 3 high-end workstations, multiple monitors, and computing power that rivaled anything at Aerologics. For the past 6 months, this room had been her sanctuary, the place where Pathos 2.0 had evolved from ambitious concept to revolutionary reality. She pulled up her development environment and began documenting everything, every algorithm, every optimization, every breakthrough that had taken Pathos from industry-leading to industry-defining. But she wasn't preparing a transition document. She was preparing a legal brief. The doorbell rang at 9:30 a.m. Eleanor opened it to find a courier with an envelope marked "Confidential." Greg Madison, CEO, Helios Navigation Systems. She'd known Greg for 15 years, ever since they'd worked together on a joint project between Aerologics and Helios to develop emergency landing protocols for commercial aircraft. He'd left the big corporate world 5 years ago to start his own company, focused on next-generation navigation solutions for the rapidly evolving aerospace industry. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper. "Coffee, I heard about Aerologics. We should talk." "Greg?" Eleanor smiled for the first time in 24 hours. She reached for her phone. Greg Madison's office, came the crisp voice of his assistant. "This is Dr. Eleanor Hayes. I believe Greg is expecting my call." "Dr. Hayes?" "Yes, he's been hoping to hear from you. One moment, please." Greg's voice came on the line, immediately warm and conspiratorial. "Eleanor, I can't say I'm surprised, but I am sorry. Victor Baines is an idiot. That's one way to put it. Listen, I know you're probably processing a lot right now, but I'd love to talk. Not just about what happened, but about what happens next. You interested in lunch?" Eleanor looked around her home office at the screens full of code that Aerologics thought they owned at the innovations they'd never bothered to understand. "I'm very interested." They met at a quiet restaurant in Bellevue, the kind of place where tech executives made deals that redefined industries. Greg was already seated when Eleanor arrived, looking exactly as she remembered Sharpsoat's sharper mind and the kind of focused intensity that had made Helios into Aerologics' most dangerous competitor. "You look remarkably composed for someone who just got stabbed in the back," he said as she sat down. "I'm processing," Eleanor replied, "but I'm also planning." Greg leaned forward. "Good, because I have a proposition that might interest you. Helios is expanding our autonomous navigation division. We're looking for someone to lead the development of next-generation systems, someone with your expertise. And you think I'd be interested in jumping from one corporate structure to another? I think you'd be interested in ownership," Greg said quietly. "Real ownership of your work, your team, your innovations, not just a salary and a title." Eleanor studied his face. Greg had always been direct, but this felt different, more urgent. "What exactly are you proposing, Chief Technology Officer, full equity package? And here's the interesting part: if you bring proprietary technology to the table, technology that you legitimately own, we'd be willing to discuss licensing agreements that could make you very wealthy." "Technology that I legitimately own," Eleanor repeated. "Technology developed on your own time with your own resources that isn't covered by Aerologics' employment agreements," Greg clarified. "Hypothetically speaking, of course." Eleanor's pulse quickened. Hypothetically. Hypothetically, such technology, if it existed, would be incredibly valuable to the right company. A company that understood its worth and was willing to compensate its creator appropriately. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, thinking through the implications. "And my team, your team would be welcome to join us. Better salaries, better working conditions, and the chance to work on cutting-edge projects without corporate interference." "You've thought this through," Greg smiled. "I've been thinking about it for months, ever since I heard rumors about Aerologics' restructuring plans. I just wasn't sure you'd be interested in making a move." "I wasn't," Eleanor said, "until yesterday." She spent the rest of the day in her home office, not coding but planning. She pulled up her employment agreement with Aerologics and read through it with the attention of a lawyer preparing for trial. The key clause was buried on page 12. Employee retains ownership of intellectual property, developed outside normal working hours using personal resources, provided such property does not directly compete with companies' existing product lines or utilize companies' proprietary information. Pathos 2. Isuro was a revolutionary advancement, but it had been built from the ground up using her own research, her own computational models, and her own time. It didn't utilize any of Aerologics' proprietary code. She'd been too careful for that. And while it was certainly competitive, it wasn't derivative. That evening, she called her lawyer Patricia Hoffman, a specialist in intellectual property law, who'd helped Eleanor with several patent applications over the years. "Eleanor, I heard about Aerologics. I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry yet," Eleanor said. "I might need your help with something complicated." "I'm listening." Eleanor explained the situation, the termination, the proprietary technology, the potential opportunity with Helios. Patricia listened without interruption, occasionally asking pointed questions about timelines, resources, and documentation. "It's risky," Patricia said finally. Aerologics will certainly challenge any claim you make to independent ownership. They'll argue that your work was derivative, that you used company resources, that there was an implicit understanding of corporate ownership. But legally, if you can demonstrate that the work was done independently and doesn't violate your employment agreement, you have a strong case. The question is whether you're prepared for the fight. Eleanor looked around, her home office at the screens, displaying months of late-night work at the innovations that had consumed her evenings and weekends. I've been preparing for this fight my whole career. I just didn't know it. Friday morning arrived with crystalline clarity. Eleanor, dressed in her best suit, charcoal gray, impeccably tailored, chosen to project confidence rather than defeat. She arrived at Aerologics at her usual time, 7:30 a.m., and found the building unusually quiet. Her team was already gathered in the conference room, their faces a mixture of anger and uncertainty. The meeting had been called by Victor Baines ostensibly to discuss the transition plan for the navigation department. As you know, Victor began, Dr. Hayes has decided to pursue other opportunities. We want to ensure a smooth transition and minimize any disruption to our ongoing projects. She didn't decide anything, Miguel said flatly. You fired her. Victor's jaw tightened. Personnel decisions are complex. What matters now is moving forward effectively. Moving forward with what? Sarah asked. Eleanor designed 90% of our current systems. The Pathos Enhancement Project is entirely her work. Dr. Hayes was part of a team, Victor said. The intellectual property she developed here belongs to Aerologics, and we're confident that the team can continue her work. Eleanor, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. Victor, could I have a word with you privately? They stepped into the adjacent conference room, and Eleanor closed the door behind them. Victor's expression was a mixture of defensiveness and barely concealed hostility. I want to make sure we're on the same page about the IP transfer, Eleanor said calmly. Everything you developed while employed here belongs to the company. That's not negotiable. Everything I developed using company resources, during company time and within the scope of my employment, Eleanor corrected. I've reviewed my employment agreement very carefully. Victor's eyes narrowed. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying that Pathos 2.0, the enhancement project you mentioned, was developed independently. On my own time, using my own equipment with my own research. It's not covered by the company's IP claims. That's ridiculous. You can't separate your work here from your work at home. It's all part of the same project. Actually, I can, and I have. Every commit, every file modification, every computational run is timestamped and documented. The enhancement system is built on entirely independent code bases. Victor's face was reddening. You're trying to steal company property. I'm trying to protect my own property, Eleanor said quietly. The same property that Aerologics has been happy to let me develop without support, without resources, and without recognition, until now. This is outrageous. I'll have legal will tell you exactly what my lawyer told me. Eleanor interrupted. That intellectual property developed independently, outside the scope of employment, belongs to its creator. Unless you can prove that I used company resources or violated my employment agreement. Victor stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the calculations running behind his eyes. The realization that maybe, just maybe, they'd underestimated the woman they'd been so eager to discard. What do you want? He asked finally. I want what I've always wanted. Recognition for my work. Fair compensation. and the respect I've earned over 17 years. It's too late for that, Eleanor nodded. Yes, it is. She returned to the main conference room where her team was waiting with barely concealed anxiety. I need to speak with all of you, she said. Not here, tonight. Romano's again, 7 o'clock. The rest of the day passed in a surreal blur of exit interviews, equipment returns, and the peculiar bureaucracy of corporate separation. Eleanor handled each task with professional efficiency, but her mind was elsewhere, running through scenarios, calculating risks, planning her next moves. At 6:45 p.m., she walked out of Aerologics for the last time, carrying a single box of personal items and a head full of revolutionary algorithms that no one else truly understood. That night at Romano's, she laid out her plan to the 5 people who mattered most: Greg's offer, the IP situation, the opportunity to build something new, something better, something that would be theirs in every sense that mattered. It's risky, she admitted. Aerologics will fight. They'll claim the technology is theirs. Challenge the patents, try to tie us up in court. Let them try, Miguel said. I've been documenting everything for months. Every time you worked on Pathos 2.0 from home, every late-night session, every weekend breakthrough. The timeline is bulletproof. And if they succeed, Lisa asked, if they somehow prove ownership? Eleanor looked around the table at these brilliant minds who'd become her family. Then we'll build something even better, from scratch, together. David raised his wine glass, to building something better. The others joined him, and Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The electric anticipation of possibility, the rush of standing at the edge of a cliff and choosing to jump. To building something better, she agreed. The next morning, Eleanor woke to find 3 missed calls from Patricia Hoffman. She called back immediately. Eleanor, we need to talk. Aerologics filed an emergency injunction this morning. They're claiming that you've stolen proprietary technology and are attempting to sell it to a competitor. Eleanor felt her stomach drop. Can they do that? They can try. The injunction is temporary, but it prevents you from sharing any technology with Helios until the court can review the case. The hearing is scheduled for next Friday. And if they win, you could face criminal charges for theft of trade secrets. But Eleanor, I've reviewed the documentation Miguel sent over. Their case is weak. They're fishing, hoping you'll settle rather than fight. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, thinking, what do you need from me? Everything, every timestamp, every development log, every receipt for equipment you purchased. We're going to prove that Pathos 2.0 is entirely your independent work. Eleanor spent the next week in a state of controlled fury, gathering documentation, preparing depositions, and working with Patricia to build an airtight case. The legal brief they submitted was a masterpiece of technical detail and legal precision, demonstrating beyond any reasonable doubt that Pathos 2.0 was Eleanor's independent creation. The hearing was held in a downtown Seattle courtroom, with lawyers from both sides presenting their arguments to Judge Margaret Chen. Eleanor sat in the gallery watching as her 17-year career was dissected and analyzed like evidence in a criminal trial. Aerologics' lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Robert Kellerman, argued that Eleanor's work was inherently derivative, that the enhancement project was a natural evolution of company-owned technology, and that her employment agreement implicitly covered all navigation-related innovations. Patricia's response was devastating in its simplicity. She presented a detailed timeline, showing that Pathos 2.0 used entirely different algorithms, was built on independent research, and had been developed using Eleanor's personal equipment. She presented receipts, development logs, and testimony from Miguel and the others confirming that Eleanor had worked on the project exclusively during her own time. The judge's decision was swift and decisive. The court finds that Dr. Hayes has demonstrated clear ownership of the technology in question. The injunction is dissolved, and Aerologix's claims are dismissed with prejudice. Eleanor felt a wave of vindication wash over her, but she knew this was just the beginning. Aerologix would appeal, would continue to fight, would make this as difficult as possible. But for now, she was free to move forward. The press coverage was immediate and intense. Former Aerologix engineer wins IP battle, read the headline in Tech Today. Navigation pioneer breaks free from corporate control, announced the Seattle Business Journal. Eleanor's story resonated with engineers and inventors across the industry who'd faced similar battles over recognition and ownership. 3 days after the hearing, Eleanor signed her contract with Helios Navigation Systems, not just as Chief Technology Officer, but as a full partner in the company's future. The Pathos 2.0 licensing agreement alone was worth more than her entire career salary at Aerologix. But the real victory came when her team, all 5 of them, joined her at Helios the following Monday. They were given better salaries, better working conditions, and most importantly, the freedom to innovate without interference. Within 6 months, Helios had launched 3 new navigation systems based on Eleanor's technology. The aviation industry took notice. Contracts poured in from major airlines, aircraft manufacturers, and government agencies. Helios went from being a mid-sized competitor to an industry leader, and Eleanor's algorithms became the new standard for autonomous flight navigation. Aerologix, meanwhile, struggled to maintain its market position without the systems they'd taken for granted. Their attempts to reverse engineer Pathos 2.0 failed spectacularly, producing systems that were unstable, unreliable, and ultimately unusable. Their stock price plummeted as contracts were canceled and competitors captured their market share. Victor Baines was fired 6 months after Eleanor's departure. Marcia Klein followed 3 months later. The company that had dismissed Eleanor as obsolete was now fighting for survival in an industry she was helping to redefine. But Eleanor's greatest satisfaction came not from her former employer's struggles, but from what she was building at Helios. The company had become a beacon for innovative engineers who wanted to work on meaningful projects without corporate interference. They were developing systems that would revolutionize not just aviation, but space exploration, autonomous vehicles, and emerging transportation technologies. One evening, 18 months after leaving Aerologix, Eleanor stood in her new office at Helios looking out at the Seattle skyline. The building was smaller than Aerologix's headquarters, but it buzzed with the energy of people who believed in what they were building. Miguel knocked on her door. "The Polaris Aviation people are here for the Pathos 3.0 demonstration." Eleanor smiled. Polaris had been Aerologix's biggest client, but they'd been so impressed with Helios's innovations that they'd switched their entire contract. It was a $1.2 billion deal, the largest in Helios's history. "Let's show them what we've built," Eleanor said. The demonstration was flawless. Pathos 3.0 was faster, more intuitive, and more reliable than anything in the market. The Polaris executives were visibly impressed, asking detailed technical questions that Eleanor answered with the confidence of someone who understood every line of code, every algorithm, every design decision. After the meeting, Greg found Eleanor in her office. "Congratulations," he said. "I think we just changed the industry again." Eleanor nodded, but she was thinking about something else. "Greg, I want to start a foundation, something that helps engineers and inventors protect their intellectual property. Too many brilliant people are getting exploited by companies that don't value innovation." The Eleanor Hayes Foundation for Intellectual Property Protection. Something like that. I want to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to others. Greg smiled. "I think that's a perfect use of your pathos royalties." Eleanor looked out her window at the city where she'd built her career, lost it, and then rebuilt it on her own terms. The rain was falling again, but it didn't sound like whispers anymore. It sounded like applause. 6 months later, the Eleanor Hayes Foundation held its first annual conference on intellectual property rights in the technology sector. The keynote speaker was Eleanor herself, addressing an audience of engineers, inventors, and entrepreneurs who were fighting their own battles for recognition and ownership. "Your work is your legacy," she told them. "Don't let anyone else write your story. Document everything, protect your innovations, and never ever let them convince you that your ideas belong to someone else simply because they're paying you a salary." The audience rose in sustained applause, but Eleanor was thinking about her team at Helios, about the systems they were building, about the future they were creating together. She'd learned that the most important ownership wasn't legal or financial. It was the ownership of your own narrative, your own value, your own place in the world. Arrow Logic still existed, but as a shadow of its former self. They'd never recovered from the loss of Eleanor's innovations or the talent drain that followed her departure. The company that had once been synonymous with cutting-edge navigation technology was now struggling to maintain relevance in an industry that had moved beyond them. Eleanor felt no satisfaction in their decline. She'd moved past the need for revenge, past the anger and betrayal that had once consumed her. She was too busy building the future to dwell on the past, but she never forgot the lesson of those 17 years that brilliance without ownership is just another form of servitude, and that the most revolutionary act an innovator can perform is to never let anyone else define their worth. In the end, Eleanor Hayes didn't just change the aviation industry, she changed the conversation about innovation ownership and the value of the human mind. And every time a young engineer stood up to a corporate giant, every time an inventor fought for recognition, every time someone refused to be written out of their own story, they were walking a path that Eleanor had carved with precision, courage, and an unshakable belief in the power of owning your own genius. The sky belonged to everyone but the algorithms that navigated it. Those belonged to the people who dreamed them into existence. And Eleanor Hayes had made sure the world would never forget that distinction.